difficult to explain why a country that exports food for all the world, we have so many hungry people. So I started to dedicate to that. And I found out that it's not an issue of production, it's an issue of access to food for the people. And that oriented all my life, my work, and that's why I came to FAO to dedicate to that, to combat hunger.
And now with you're here with the Nobel Peace Prize Forum looking at climate change. Can you please start talking with us a little bit about what you've learned about the relationship between climate change, food production, and then also food security?
Well, in fact, I have to say that everything that we are doing now in FAO is being affected by climate change. And most the areas that we have achieved a very good level of production. And even in areas, difficult areas like Africa countries, we are starting to move back on main achievements due to the impact of climate change. It's amazing to see that in the same area sometimes we have, during the same year, a prolonged drought and then a flood. So this is what things is changing for us. We cannot expect the normal patterns of rainfalls, for example. And more water scarcity is affecting all our production. But it's not about only produce more food. It's also about producing nutrition foods. We found out that the raising temperature and the volume of gas emissions are affecting the nutrition of the food. So the wheat, for example, more and more less proteins in the wheat, less vitamins, much more difficult to preserve the food you harvest because insects are proliferating in a way that we never saw before. And pests and disease are spreading also in a velocity that we could not control anymore. So I would summarize that what we see nowadays is that the impact of climate change on food security and food production basically can bring us back to the beginning of agriculture story, because before agriculture 1,000 years ago, we used to wake up in the morning, the human beings, and collect the fruits and hunt for our survival. This uncertainty about if we would find the food we need every day is back. This is the point. Instead of food security, we have food insecurity now growing. For 3 consecutive years, the number of hungry people has raised. And among the most important drivers are conflicts and impact of climate change. And also when they overlapping, there's an overlapping of the conflict and climate change. This is the worst situation. And this is happening, for example, in the Sahel region, in the Near East countries, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan. We are seeing that the tension is behind the conflicts comes from climate change, comes from conflict for water, comes from conflict between pastors and farmers, and so on.
So climate change is creating conditions for conflict. It's also impacting the food. These are very complex situations. So how is it that, how do you approach this from, but there's so many variables, what's the systems approach that you're looking at?
We have different fronts. One important front is the science. Let's say we are looking for food that is drought resistance, for example. And we can find in nature. It's amazing to see that this is not something new for our lives. We found, for example, the quinoa in the Andean region that does not need water as much as need the rice or the wheat. So quinoa can be a good solution for dried areas, and it's a very nutritious cereal also. But we are also working on another front, that's water management. Water became more important nowadays than access to land. If you have land and don't have water, nothing. It means nothing. So water management has become very, very important, fundamental condition for food production. And we are looking for new technologies like the gut-a-gut irrigation, or even varieties that can be tolerant to saline water. Is a promising area that we are working on, and so on. So different fronts we are open. One particular problem is to storage. We are looking for also preserve the food, because when we can harvest a good year, we lose a lot of food due to the lack of appropriate storage conditions. So combating food and loss also is another very important front. We throw out, or we lost 1/3 of what we produce nowadays. And that's not the food that goes out. That's the water we use to produce it, that's the land we use to produce it. Degraded land is growing. We are losing areas for the desert. In Africa, for example, in the Sahel border, we see year after year how the desert is growing. And we are working on this front also to try to put a green wall, as we call, a forest area. Reforestation is the one very powerful tool that we have to stop desertification nowadays. So, as I said, there are many fronts. All them, I must say, are usual things. They are not very sophisticated, except for this front of the science for new genetic areas, are things that we know. What we need is funding. We are lacking behind on funding, very much. There is no funding available for farmers. Farmers are poor people. Farmers are among the poorest in the world. They don't have the possibility to fund themselves this adaptation that is needed. And this is the point where FAO is working more.
So when you are talking about technology solutions and you're talking about stopping waste, what is the human element of that? What would you like to see communities do? What power do communities and individuals have to help you?
First, change our habits of consumption. I think that we need to rethink about what we eat and how we eat, because we are eating much more than we need. It's interesting that we are facing a problem of hunger numbers rising, but also obesity. Obesity is the most important issue nowadays, much more than hunger. Hunger is concentrated in some areas where we have conflict and impact of droughts, prolonged droughts, for example. Obesity is everywhere. Poor and rich countries, obesity is growing in a velocity that we never imagined before. Would you believe me that the hunger and obesity are growing fast in Africa than in all other regions of the world? We should not expect that. And this is for the habits of consumption. We are eating more and more processed food with high levels of fats, sugar, salt, instead of eating fresh food, vegetables, fruits, locally produced. So all those things we need to start to rethink about. There is a completely redesign of the food systems that we need.
And could you say more on that in terms of the food system and how it contributes to climate change?
Well, in different ways. The first, the food waste and loss that we have exacerbate for the fact that we transport food from remote regions to another regions. We became a generation that only eat commodities, or most eat commodities, instead of eating local foods. We also see that this issue of processed food is a long value chain, and that exacerbates the possibility of food loss in this long chain. So if we had shortened circuits of food, local food production and local consumption, we would reduce this food loss, and we would benefit from more fresh food to eat. So it's a big change. Huh? It's not here and there, but it's important that we have our role as consumers also to play, and this is very important.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the role of business, and how can business work with civil society and communities to work together in terms of solving this issue?
Well, business is also always important. I just spoke about funding, for example, but we need to consider that without the engagement of private sector on this change, it will not be possible in our timeline. The private sector is at the top of the food chain, so they must be involved.
Thank you so much for your time. We're so grateful.
Wonderful.